Hey guys, welcome back to the weekly worm farm check-in. We're gonna check in on this budget worm farm that I've got right here. We did this last week and I really like the feedback that I got from you guys. It's changing it up a little bit. We're getting our hands dirty with a worm farm. We'll be doing this for the urban worm bag as well, but for now we've just got this, this budget worm farm that you see right here. So last week we did a feeding. We had some banana peels, one apple core, I think. We had a lot of coffee grounds with the filters, and we added that with pit moss. And the one thing I noticed before we did the feeding was that it looked like we had way too much moisture. I was squeezing the vermicompost, a whole lot of water came out between my knuckles, and I said, okay, we need to reduce the moisture a little bit. So we added a lot of pit moss, but then I couldn't help myself and I added way too much water again. So even what I put in last week, while I think it helped the moisture a little bit, still ended up with too much water. So we're gonna look at the worm farm this week. We're gonna see what's going on in there. We're gonna check the temperature and the moisture like we usually do. And then we're gonna talk about kind of what we see inside and what we're gonna do for the next week. So one of the things that I told you last week was that this worm farm was used as the basis for my How to Start a Worm Farm YouTube video that I did. It's one of my most popular videos. The thing is after I did that video, I ended up just neglecting this bin. But believe it or not, things were still fine in it. It went through the winter and it still had a worm population in it that was pretty reasonable when we checked it out last week. So this worm farm does not have a real huge population of worms, but I'm trying to use this series to show you how not only can you do things imperfectly and still have a good worm bin, but maybe we can even coax this worm population back into making it a bit more of a thriving worm population than you're gonna see. So anyway, let's get started. Let's see what's going on with this worm farm. All right, so one of the things I'm always gonna do with this series here as we open up the worm farm is we're gonna go over what the temperatures look like. So right now outside it's about 70 degrees. It's 76 degrees here in my barn. We got about 71% humidity and we're showing about 82 to 84 degrees inside the vermicompost. One of the reasons why I talk about temperature all the time is I wanna demonstrate that your worm farm doesn't necessarily take on the temperature of what's going on outside. Sometimes it's going to be cooler, especially in the heat, and in the more extreme cold temperatures, it's going to be warmer. So you don't need to freak out about, oh, it's 96 degrees outside, my worms must be cooking. They're not going to do that because your vermicompost temperature is going to change more slowly than the outside air temperature. So anyway, we'll remove the bubble wrap here and we'll take a look at what's going on. One of the things that I noticed on the outside of the bin, you can see that there's, and I'll show you another picture, there's evidence of worm castings, which means that worms have climbed the walls of this bin. But right now we don't see any condensation. And when worms crawl the walls, it's because they are exploring that condensation that is on the walls. They love moisture and they're gonna go anywhere that it is. So this bin right now has no condensation, which I kind of would have expected because we didn't give it a real heavy water feeding last week. So anyway, no worms on the walls. We do have some worms that are gonna be below the surface. We can find a few good pockets of worms here. Again, we are not starting with a huge worm population, so I don't expect to see a ton of worms. Now here's one cool thing. I just found it. I just saw a cocoon. Oh, I hope I can find it again to show it to you, because that's one of the things that we're going to look for is evidence of worm breeding and worm cocoons, which are going to be little kind of lemon shaped little capsules that'll have about three-ish worms or so in them. Anyway, I honestly this week was not expecting to see really any evidence of reproduction just because we don't have a real dense worm population here, and you typically want a dense enough worm population where there's going to be enough opportunity for worms to encounter each other and maybe make a love connection. We really don't have that, so the reproduction is probably going to be slower since our population is pretty low and we don't kind of have that optimum density. The things I'm looking for this week are how much the food waste that we put in last week has broken down. This was a bit of a broccoli stalk that I think was part of last week's feeding. It's not broken down, but I wouldn't expect it to. It looks like the coffee filters themselves really haven't started breaking down. That's kind of to be expected as well. The coffee grounds kind of blend in with the rest of the rest of the vermicompost. So this has only been a week since we fed. I wasn't expecting to see a ton of change. We're gonna do a bit of an odd feeding this week just to basically deal with the moisture. One of the things I wanted to tell you about, speaking of worm breeding, was I really thought that I had some actual breeding going on because I looked in there and saw what looked like little baby worms. Now, what I was seeing were actually these little guys, which are, he's curled up into a ball right now, but it's a millipede. So you can sometimes be fooled by millipedes in your worm bin, the baby ones especially. You won't be fooled by the bigger ones, but the baby millipedes actually look quite a bit like little earthworms, especially when they're kind of extended, not curled up in a ball like this guy is. Let's see if we can find another one. They've been fairly easy to find. All right, so this is a good example of a baby millipede. As it kind of gets extended, it actually looks like a baby worm. Just like worms do, these things kind of darken as they get older. So it's really easy to be fooled by a baby millipede. The one way you can tell if it's a millipede or not, and unfortunately you'd probably be harming a baby earthworm if you got it wrong, was if you pick it up and it's gonna feel rigid. It's right there in between my fingers and it feels hard. And actually if I squeeze it, you can almost feel it popping. You would not feel that with a juvenile earthworm. So we do have some millipedes in the bin. Again, not a problem. Millipedes are not a problem in a worm farm. Centipedes are a problem in a worm farm. Those are little meat-eating bugs that will feast on your worms. Millipedes are just good co-composters. They help to shred organic matter, and they really are kind of a welcome addition in a worm farm. I know a lot of new worm farmers expect only to see worms, get alarmed when they see anything else, but believe me, when you've got a rich, moist bunch of organic matter like this, you're going to attract things that are other than worms. So if you remember last week, I was talking about how we had too much moisture. Oh, hey, I want to show you this. Here is a cocoon. So they are making babies. If you can see that little guy right there, I would imagine that thing has been there for a week or less. It is also going to darken as it matures, and about 21 days after it's formed, it's going to hatch 3 to 5 baby worms, which will then become sexually mature 42 days later. So this is a good sign. I'm glad to see this. We really wasn't expecting to see it, but hey, we've got good things going on in the worm bin. So I'm going to grab another handful. Hopefully there's not too many worms or cocoons or anything like that in there. And we're going to give this a squeeze. And you can see all the water that came through my knuckles. Oops, there were a few worms in there. Sorry, guys. So we still have a little bit too much moisture, and I was kind of expecting that because I made that screw up of adding way too much moisture last week. I couldn't help myself. So what we're gonna do this week with this bin, it's gonna be a little bit of a boring feeding, I hate to say. So we're gonna be adding coconut coir. I've got some right here. You can see it's gonna be very dry. We're gonna add coconut coir. We're gonna add a little bit of sand for grit. One of the things you guys mentioned last week was why I didn't add grit. I don't always add grit. In fact, it's probably a very much a minority of the time that I do add grit to the worm farm. So we are going to add a whole lot of coconut coir and a little bit of grit, and we're gonna mix all of this up. Again, this is not like a layered kind of bottom to top worm farm that you might do with continuous flow where you're gonna harvest from the bottom. That would be like GlideGear CFT or even the urban worm bag where you feed it from the top and you harvest it from the bottom. We're gonna consider this all kind of one big layer. So what I'm gonna do right now, I'm gonna take a lot of that coconut coir and I'm just gonna dump it all in. This is a big feeding. Why I'm doing this is I want to sop up a lot of that excess moisture that is in the bin. This is probably a little bit too much. I'd rather underdo it a little bit than overdo it like I did last week. So we're gonna take this, we're gonna take some sand here. And again, this is for grit. This stuff's a little bit darker than you would expect just because it's also kind of wet, a little bit wet. So we're gonna stick this in here, but not too much. And then I'm just gonna mix all of this together. And what's gonna happen is that coconut coir is gonna act like kitty litter on a spill. So, you might dump something inside the house and you'd use kitty litter to help sop up the moisture, and we're gonna do that here today. And what's funny is I'm sort of freaking out right now because I feel like I'm way overdoing the coconut coir, but I bet when we come back next week, a moisture level that is pretty appropriate. So I kind of digging the bottom out and kind of bringing it to the top and just trying to make it all kind of a more of a homogeneous mixture. One of the things I want to tell you about was, as wet as I said it was last week, I actually took the bin. So you can see this is actually 2 bins. This is a worm farm sitting inside of another bin. And the bottom of this bin has holes drilled in it to allow excess moisture to get out the bottom into this bottom bin. This bottom bin was bone dry, so there wasn't enough for it to actually start dripping out into that bottom bin. So I'm really happy about that. So again, I'm just gonna be taking this wetter, kind of crumbly stuff. You can see plenty of worms because they're attracted to the moisture, and I'm just mixing this all up. The worms are not real happy with me right now, just like they weren't last week, but again, they're not forming a union, so they'll forgive me. So I'm just gonna do this a little bit more. Okay, so I've got this coconut coir pretty thoroughly mixed through here. The one thing we're gonna do now is we're gonna do that squeeze test again. And there's a couple ways. The thing with the squeeze test that you're trying to do is obviously see what the moisture is. And if you've got the right moisture, you should only be getting about a drop or 2 between your knuckles. So let's see what happens here. You can see that there's plenty of coconut coir that's kind of suffused throughout all this material. And if I squeeze, I actually am still, if I squeeze this, I'm actually still getting some water that is coming out in between my knuckles. So we actually have, you know, I told you I was freaking out because I thought it was just going to be way too dry, but it's still not way too dry. So I'm actually pretty happy with how this is turning out right now. I think it's going to be good that we did this. I think we're going to be happy next week when we come back and check out the worm farm. This, you know, coconut coir is not really a food itself. It's a bedding. It sort of becomes a food because it's an organic waste that breaks down, but it doesn't have a ton of stuff that the worms are going to find attractive. So we're going to give this also a fairly liberal sprinkling of worm chow. So worm chow is a protein-rich food that the worms like. A lot of the worm breeders will use this to fatten up their worms. It's just this nice powdery stuff that spreads well right on top. I'm just going to leave this in a layer. I'm not going to mix this in because I'm going to be fascinated to see when we uncover this thing in a week or 2 what it looks like. You may not see worms that are consuming right at the top, but you'll see a lot more that are just under the surface than you saw this week. That's going to conclude what we're doing here this week with the weekly worm farm check-in. Put the bubble wrap back in, put the thermometer back in, and we'll see you here next week or the week after. Okay guys, I hope you found that helpful. You notice this week we just did a dry feeding, trying to sop up some of that excess moisture. I think next week or the week after we can do a bit more of a wet feeding, kind of the normal food waste. We're getting into Halloween season coming up. We're coming into September, so we're not quite to having the pumpkins just yet. But I would like to get this bin to the point where it's got a moisture level that is appropriate to take an even greater addition of moisture with pumpkins. So I want to reduce the moisture a little bit in the anticipation of us getting pumpkins here in a month or 2. So you'll notice with what I'm doing with this series is that we're kind of playing whack-a-mole a little bit. We're just taking what we see with the worm farm, we're adjusting things and then coming back the next week and then seeing what adjustments we need to make for that week and the weeks beyond. So again, we can do things very imperfectly, still have a thriving worm farm, still be able to process our household food waste without doing things perfectly. So speaking of doing things perfectly, you're probably not doing things perfectly. You probably want a little bit of help. We do have a very helpful PDF guide called the Worm Farm Roadmap that you can download right now. So the one thing that YouTube has made it difficult to do is actually take you off of YouTube to my own website. So they make it a little more difficult now. Used to be you could just click a little link, which will be right here right now, but it's going to take you to the video description. You'll see a little picture down there. you'll be able to click that picture, go to the website, sign up for the PDF, and get that guide immediately. All right, guys, hope that was helpful. We'll see you next week.